Oh, I really didn't want to fuck around.
Where are we even going to end up?
There are shellings everywhere.
There's probably some kind of base in Crimea or positions here in Crimea.
On August 12th, something terrible started in Crimea.
This is fucked up!
Ukrainian Neptunes attacked 3 nuclear airfields in Crimea. Everything is on fire.
Yeah, no way. No, absolutely no way. I mean, no way at all.
Boom! Bada boom!
Easy, easy, easy. Are you filming?
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
There were explosions in Sevastopol, Simferopol, and Yevpatoria in the Bakhchisarai district. Alushta, Feodosia, Saki, and Novofedorivka. Holy shit! The airfields of Saki, Gvardeyskaya, and Kirovskaya are burning.
This is an explosion.
How is that?
The Ukrainian armed forces have launched powerful special operations in Crimea to destroy Russian military personnel. Nuclear triad. The Black Sea Fleet, airfields, and oil refineries are under attack.
Look, it's flying!
Fuck, what a train station they hit.
The damn flares were flying.
Give the order for fuck's sake!
Crimea was burning last night. 4 key military airfields were attacked. That's where the strategic nuclear combat base takes off from.
This is fucked up.
Saki, Gvardeyskaya, Kirovskaya. A strike on aviation. About 200 drones attacked Crimea last night. The drones targeted the airfields at Saki, Gvardeyskaya, and Kirovskaya. NASA satellites recorded a massive fire near the Gvardeyskaya airfield in Crimea. At the Crystal oil depot in Engels, another fuel tank caught fire. The whole city is covered in smoke. As they say, the show must go on, or the commotion at the Crystal oil depot in Engels has been going on for several days now. Meanwhile, Russia has lost another Su-25. Special Operation Forces destroyed a decision-making center in the Kherson direction. And also the headquarters of the occupiers in Makivka was attacked and blown up. Let's discuss all this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. Wishing everyone good health.
Roman Grigorievich, let's start with the hell in occupied Crimea. More than 200 drones attacked 3 key military airfields, Gvardeyskoye, Saki, and Kirovskoye. Novofedorivka was attacked. The floor is yours.
Novofedorivka is a depot near Saki. So basically, it's one complex, Novofedorivka and the Saki airfield. The strike on Crimea today was indeed on a large scale. This is what we have repeatedly requested, let's put it mildly, on air, because we kept circling around Crimea but didn't touch Crimea itself. It was kind of a sacred cow, so to speak. Honestly, today was a well-executed, solid attack. Really, 200 drones can overwhelm any air defense, any at all. Thanks to the large number of decoys, at the very least, the Russian air defense forces expended a lot of missiles today. And yet, quite significant damage was still inflicted on Russian airfields in Saki, near Simferopol, and of course near Sevastopol. And drones even reached Kerch. There are 2 airfields there that are now being prepared, I would say, as launch sites for new batches of Garan 2 and Garan 3 drones. And these 2 airfields were also attacked, at least as of now. The operation was well thought out, excellently executed, and most likely carried out by our army, so this is not a special operation, but rather most likely regular army work. You could even say already under the leadership of Madhyar, the newly appointed commander of the unmanned systems forces. Although in reality, of course, operations in Crimea should be carried out by our sailors, that is the Navy, the naval forces. Within the naval forces, there should be their own Madhyar, their own sailor Madhyar, who will create unmanned systems forces specifically focused on maritime operations, underwater, surface, and aerial, for the liberation of Crimea. If today's attack is not a one-off but systematic, then believe me, by the end of the year, at least half of the Russians in Crimea will simply disappear. They'll just be gone. Because if this happens every day, even with just 100, even 100 drones targeting airfields, airfields first, definitely. Why airfields? The Russians use airfields in several ways. First, as bases for tactical or army aviation. That means airplanes and helicopters. Second, they use the airfield to deploy anti-aircraft missile systems and radar units of the Russian Federation's radio-technical troops. And third, they use almost all airfields as transit depots for transferring ammunition. That's why for us, it's especially important, first and foremost, to destroy the airfields and everything on them. Airfield technical equipment, vehicles, ammunition, and of course, aircraft.
Roman Grigorievich, I wanted to talk to you about aviation. In the meantime, dear audience, please like this video. In the comments, let us know what you think about the successful operations of the Ukrainian armed forces and about the idea Crimea burn, military targets, and Russians swimming freestyle and breaststroke back to Russian territory. Roman Grigorievich, can we assume that at these airfields that were attacked last night, enemy aircraft were also targeted, or did we only strike the fuel facilities there? What do you think?
Well, Russian aircraft are not stationed at all of those airfields right now. They have mostly pulled back to the central and western airfields, the eastern airfields in Crimea. That's why some of the airfields are used by the Russians either for army aviation, for helicopters, since the airfields are so-called forward operating bases, or for deploying anti-aircraft missile systems and radio technical troops. So this is very important for us. In order to deliver serious strikes against Russian aviation, including for that, you first need to achieve air superiority. That begins with destroying ground-based surveillance and response systems, meaning those same anti-aircraft missile systems. That's exactly what started today. The thing is, several times such operations have already started, but then they were cut short. It's as if by the wave of a magic wand. How many times have we talked about this? Well, here's the beginning, here's the start, and then suddenly it shuts down again for a month and a half, 2 months, and no one even glances at Crimea at least. Well, now I just don't want to make a mistake again. If this is the beginning of Crimea's liberation, then attacks like this should happen every night. Every night, 100 drones should be flying into Crimea.
Roman Grigorievich, regarding the SBU special operation, Novorossiysk, and also the missile carriers. We see how, during massive missile attacks, missile carriers go out into the Black Sea. As far as I understand, they hide them in Novorossiysk and bring them out to sea on the necessary days. The question is, how can we attack all the missile carriers today so that the Black Sea fleet ceases to exist?
Well, they have up to 100 ships and submarines left. Both submarines, there are 4 of them, and surface ships are missile carriers, at least carriers of caliber missiles. The submarines mainly have 4 caliber missiles in their torpedo tubes, while the ships can have 4, 6, or 8. Well, it depends on what kind of launcher is installed. A few months ago, our banking company, Spankovi, made a commitment to the Saudis not to strike Russian oil refineries, the Russian oil industry, and also the Black Sea fleet. That's why they now feel right at home, as they say, at least in the eastern waters of the Black Sea. So here the question is, first of all, for the politicians. Well, actually, it's not even for the politicians anymore. Now it's a question for the special services. Why haven't they arrested for treason those politicians who ensured the safety of the Russian hydrocarbon sector and the Russian Black Sea fleet? The Russians leave the base, say Novorossiysk, and go out to sea only to avoid being hit. That is, when they enter the base, it's a compact area with a high concentration of Russian ships, so they leave to avoid being targeted, and then naturally they return, mainly for maintenance purposes.
If we analyze whether the Ukrainian special services could carry out something similar, but only on Russian territory, do our capabilities match theirs? Let's discuss this.
Well, from a military standpoint, the preparation and execution of the operation were at the highest level. Special services were involved, including Mossad and several other Israeli intelligence agencies, plus the Air Force. Again, pay attention. The main thing here is the Air Force, meaning long-range strike capabilities. 200 fighter jets or various types of aircraft took off and struck previously identified targets. Moreover, the air defense systems had been practically neutralized beforehand by a Mossad special operation. In other words, it was a combined attack, well thought out, well prepared, and well executed. But that's from a military perspective. It's like if we were now discussing whether the executioner's axe that beheaded the king was well sharpened. Well, yes, it was well sharpened, no question about it. The question is, why was there a need to behead at all? That's a different question, a different aspect altogether. The fact is, Israeli strikes on Iran at this point would ignite a war in the Middle East, and that would affect us as well. At the very least, it would hit us first and foremost by driving up oil prices. Right now, the price of oil has already risen by more than 10%, and it could go up by as much as 30%. In other words, oil could rebound to $100 per barrel. That means Russia would receive twice as many petrodollars as before. There had been a trend toward lower oil prices, a trend toward a decline in Russia's economy. Now, everything is the opposite, a complete turnaround. There will be a rise in oil prices, an increase in revenues for the Russian hydrocarbon sector, and naturally, a growth in the production of military equipment, the purchase of ammunition, and the mobilization of new recruits. So the war in the Middle East will hit us very hard through the surge in Russia. And at that very moment, when it was necessary to destroy the Russian hydrocarbon sector, our banking Kaganaut shielded Russian oil and gas facilities from attacks by our special services and our army. How can we counteract this? We need to reactivate the mechanism of Malyuk's sanctions and strikes. The most effective sanctions against the Russian oil and gas sector are its complete destruction. All the more so since it is begging to be destroyed. But so that in the end already, yes, even Russian partisans are doing this. Well, we can see how they set fire to forests where Russian oil pipelines run, how they set fires, even as we mentioned, in the far eastern Ukrainian People's Republic in Komsomolsk-on-Amur, which is actually Dunair, our so-called green wedge. An oil refinery was burning there.
Roman Grigorievich, why is it that what can be done with Iran can't be done with Russia today?
Well, first of all, we have nothing to do it with. Believe me, if we had the means, some of our agencies would have done it long ago. We don't have missiles, we don't have ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, even though we should have them in a missile-producing country like Ukraine. And there are no missiles. Well, it's both laughable and tragic. This is a question for the authorities, for all the authorities. In more than 30 years of our independence, we have ended up without missiles during Russian offensive operations. So clearly, this is something only we can do. It's up to us to do it. Us. No one is going to do anything for us, and there's no point in asking anyone. We have to do this and strike at the Russian leadership, including those who are where? In the Kremlin, the Rubliovka bathhouses and the Kremlin. How long have we been talking about this? 3 years. What should we have? What should it be? What should it be with? Strikes on certain Iranian military targets. Well, first of all, nuclear facilities. Well, it's not that easy to reach a nuclear facility. For example, the facility that was attacked by the Israelis is buried more than 50 meters underground. You can't just reach it like that. That's one. And second, above this facility, above the centrifuges, above the reactor and the centrifuges, there is an 8-meter thick layer of concrete. So they really prepared thoroughly there. So if we're being realistic, Iran's nuclear facilities weren't actually damaged. Bushehr, for example, is a plant that runs on Russian fuel, and it wasn't touched in this regard. There are about 5 or 6 Iranian facilities, and for the most part, they only tried to hit one of them. But even then, they only managed to strike from above. Inside, everything kept working as it did before. The centrifuges keep spinning, so what will Iran's response be? Well, who knows? Especially now since, so to speak, Pandora's box has been opened. In other words, there was a strike on a nuclear facility. That means Iran could now retaliate with nuclear means, even with nuclear waste for that matter. If they take the waste out of Bushehr now with strontium and cesium and dump it on Israel, then, as far as I know, with cesium, you wouldn't be able to live there for 24,000 years. And if they hit with uranium-235 or uranium-238, one has a half-life of 700 million years and the other 4.5 billion years. So can you imagine what would happen to Israel in that case? So again, who will end up suffering? The Zionists will slip away, they'll run off to the United States. It will be the ordinary, regular Israelis who are left behind to deal with the radiation. These are things that simply cannot be allowed. Strikes on nuclear facilities. They are fundamentally unacceptable a priori. There are certain international control mechanisms, including the IAEA, and it is allowed there in some respects. Now, the extension of the 2015 agreement was already prepared, again under the supervision of the IAEA together with the Europeans, which is why the Israelis struck preemptively, only to prevent the agreement with Europe and the IAEA. That is, they did not give Iran the opportunity to conclude this agreement. If the agreement had been in place, it would have operated from 2015 to 2018, and during that time, the IAEA fully monitored all stages of uranium enrichment. That's why the Israelis have now created, or rather, not even that, the Israelis have created a problem for ordinary Israelis. And what the response will be, well, it's hard to say right off the bat, but the Iranians aren't simple people either, believe me. There are at least an order of magnitude more of them, just in terms of numbers, and no one is going to forgive things like this. That's why there's still a serious bloody war ahead, which for us, it's negative. It hasn't brought us any positives and it won't bring any. Why? Because the Shaheds that everyone talks about, the Iranian ones and so on, are actually the Chinese Sunflower 200. The Russian Geran is not an Iranian Shahed. The Russian Geran is the Chinese Sunflower 200. No matter how many military facilities you destroy in Iran, the Russians have been assembling the Chinese Sunflower 200 from Chinese parts and calling it Geran, and they will keep doing so. If you really want to target the main production plants, then you'd have to go after the Chinese ones. Are the Israelis going to fly to China to destroy Chinese factories? This is something our intelligence services should be doing. These are questions for our intelligence services.
Dear audience, please like this video. Let us know what you think in the comments. We're returning to our main topic, the Russian aggression, the war of Russia against Ukraine. Roman Grigorievich, regarding the oil depot, for example, at the Crystal oil depot in Engels, another fuel tank caught fire. The whole city is covered in smoke. Essentially, drones attacked the oil depot on the night of June 5th to 6th, but the fire still hasn't been extinguished. Let's evaluate this operation.
Well, first of all, this isn't just an oil depot, or rather, it's not an ordinary oil depot. If we're talking about oil depots, the Russians have thousands of them. But in reality, this is the fuel and lubricants storage facility for the Engels 2 strategic aviation airfield. And it's precisely in this capacity that it's very important for us. This is a supply depot, the main base and primary storage for aviation kerosene. It's underground, located in karst caves and caisson reservoirs. In other words, just try to get to it. There are tens of thousands of tons of kerosene there. So from this underground reservoir, the fuel is pumped into the supply base, into the crystal, and then, well, the base, or the POL, petroleum oil and lubricants depot, as we call it. From there, it goes on to refuel the same aircraft. And the right spot was chosen, where at least the main flow could be cut off. Of course, they also have a backup option where they can refuel directly from the caissons. But I think we'll get to those as well. So the strike on this pole depot was excellently executed, precisely calculated. We discussed before how the attack was carried out. They broke through the Russian air defense head-on using a large number of decoy drones, and the strike drones got through, took out the target, and set 3 tanks on fire at once, right from the start. And until it burns out completely, this won't stop. Kerosene is an interesting product. You can actually use it to put out fires. If you take a bucket of kerosene and pour it on a fire, the fire goes out. But it's the kerosene vapors that burn. And if you heat the kerosene up to a certain temperature and then ignite the vapors, which is what happened during the strike by our drones, then it's almost impossible to put it out. And in fact, they don't even try to extinguish it. They just step aside, dig a trench around it, and watch until it all burns out. And until everything there has burned out, it will keep burning. It could burn for another month.
Roman Grigorievich, today's news. Russia has lost another Su-25.
Well, most likely these are losses related to technical issues. These Su-25s are already 40 years old. They've been flying since the Afghan war, since the 1980s. They were good aircraft, even excellent for their time when they were built, a solid attack plane. But now they're old, really old grandpas, I would say. And technologically, of course, they're falling apart. And there aren't that many airframes left when you can only make 1 out of 2 or 3. So this fleet of aircraft the Russians have is dwindling. And even when they go down like today, when a Russian plane was lost.
Roman Grigorievich, over the past 2 days, we've also attacked the Moscow region where there were military targets. Roman Grigorievich, what exactly was attacked near Moscow in the last few days? Because the drones didn't reach Moscow, but explosions were heard near Moscow. They say those were military targets.
Approximately 30% of Russia's highly advanced and sophisticated high-tech military production is primarily concentrated within the bustling metropolis of Moscow and its surrounding expansive Moscow region, a critical hub for defense industries. So a third is in Moscow and the Moscow region. That's why it's so important for us to break through and keep pushing through the Russian air defenses. It's very difficult to do this because there are at least 2 blocking detachments in place. The first is the frontal air defense, which is very hard to break through. This is in the Bryansk, Belgorod, and Tula regions, where the air defenses are practically packed, especially in the direction of Moscow. And the second is the site-specific air defense around Moscow. So sometimes we see in the reports that the Russians shot down 50 or 70 of our drones in the Bryansk and Belgorod regions. These were headed for Moscow. Mostly they're shooting down decoys, which cost just a few $100s. But a missile to shoot it down costs tens of thousands of dollars. Nevertheless, some get through. A strike hit a plant in the Moscow region that produces electronic circuit boards. As I said, this is a high-tech facility, and at least for now, the technological process has been halted. But in reality, to actually reach Moscow, you need ballistic missiles. In other words, without ballistic missiles, we won't be able to break through Moscow's air defense for strategic targets. Drones won't be able to take it out.
Roman Grigorievich, in the Moscow region, a microelectronics factory in Zubovo was attacked. There's a hole in the roof. The factory in Zubovo is a production complex that's part of the Resonet Technopark in the Moscow region. It specializes in the production of printed circuit boards and electronic components for various industries, including defense and manufacturing. That's what this is about.
That's exactly what I was talking about. Yes, so they hit Resonet directly, and the technological process has been halted. The most important thing is that it can only be destroyed with ballistic missiles. Well, even a drone with a 50-kilogram payload won't be able to completely disable any military facility.
Roman Grigorievich, from a military standpoint, how many years would it take for Ukraine to develop ballistic missiles? And not just a few, of course, but in mass production. How long would that take? 1,000 missiles a year. If we take the example of other countries that produce ballistic missiles.
Well, the thing is, Ukraine is a missile-producing country. Back in the Soviet Union, we had a full production cycle for several types of missiles, starting from air-to-air and air-to-ship missiles. Take the Kh-35 and Kh-35U, which the Neptune missile is based on. This is an aircraft-launched anti-ship missile, so it's a ship missile derived from an air-launched one. We produced it entirely ourselves, the full production cycle. There were several other missiles of this kind as well, and ballistic missiles too. We produced ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, you could say, the Kh-35U especially for this level. And as for ballistic missiles, we produced intercontinental ballistic missiles, the Satan SS-18. That was our production Yuzhmash. It has a range of 11,000 kilometers. That means it could reach Beijing and Pyongyang. So we have preserved the entire technological chain, technical documentation, the production system, very important mechanisms for certain tests, test stands, and of course the engineering stuff. About 10 years ago, we were producing and launching the Grom, a whole complex that we developed with an investment of $100 million with an audit. And we sold it to them as well. That was just a few years ago. So we have the entire production base for manufacturing ballistics. It's not like we're starting from scratch. In order to launch, say, serial production of those same Groms with a range of 500 kilometers, we would need somewhere around $150 to $200 million and about a year and a half to 2 years. So if this government had started this 6 years ago, by now we could have launched serial production of the Grom 2 3 times over. If at this point we don't have this Grom, and we don't, because otherwise it would have long since been used on Moscow. That means for 6 years this government has just been dragging its feet. That's the big problem. The executive branch should have been sent to the armed forces of Ukraine a long time ago. I've said so many times already, we need to deshmihalize the executive branch. You don't need elections or re-elections for that. This is in accordance with our constitution, according to the legal framework of our laws. And replace the executive branch. Shmyhal's team just can't handle it, absolutely can't. The deceased Shmyhal and all the rest of that Shmyhal crowd, they're not in the right place. They need to be replaced by professionals who know how to quickly launch a program, even a ballistic one, and how to restructure the country's economy for wartime. But that's an entire process. The work should be done by military people with basic military education and who understand economics. We have enough people like that.
Roman Grigorievich is wrapping up. The Special Operation Forces have destroyed the Russia's decision-making center in the Kherson direction. The Russia's headquarters in Makivka was also attacked. A video report of the HIMARS MLRS strike was sent to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Everyone wrote that there were many killed, many wounded. The floor is yours.
Well, about Makivka, I'm from Makivka myself. I've been saying for a while now, why aren't we hitting their rear positions? So most likely our rocket troops thought, let's make Svitan curse up and down, and went ahead and struck Makivka. The main thing is, it was not far from my house. In other words, they completed the combat mission, of course. Well done. The range allows for it. We have the means to strike. HIMARS work well at that range. And of course, in Kherson, on the so-called southern front. There's a lot of Russian activity there right now. They're still at a crossroads. Where to transfer the remaining reserves, either to reinforce the Zaporizhzhia direction, meaning the operations there, or to the right bank of the Dnipro near Kherson. So they still haven't decided yet, because the reserves that could have helped them in either direction Putin burned through before May 9th, setting unrealistic, that is unachievable objectives. So now, at this moment, we can say, let's thank Putin for his complete idiocy in strategic planning. Because it's precisely his idiocy, this political trap, that's giving us a breather right now. We still have about 2 months before the next wave of reserves arrives. In these 2 months, can we give the Russians a hard time? Well, we'll see. We'll see what we'll give them a hard time for, and then we'll see, and we'll talk about it in each of our reviews.
Roman Grigorievich, we're already at the end. The Russian armed forces have entered Yablonovka in the Sumy region, according to Deep State. That's 26 kilometers from the regional center. The gray zone has also expanded in Yunakovka, a village at the epicenter of the fighting. So please comment on this, it's very important.
Yablonovka and Yunakovka. Well, yesterday they said they were 20 kilometers from Sumy, and now it's already 26 kilometers. So does that mean they're having a negative advance? They retreated 6 kilometers in the opposite direction? That's about where they are, somewhere between 20 and 30 kilometers. They're stuck there and will keep being stuck in that area. It's a small bridgehead there, even if you look at it just from the perspective of Sumy region, not to mention all of Ukraine. A small bridgehead that the Russians jumped into on the heels of our retreating troops. That was a mistake made by our own politicians. Here we were thanking Putin for his political decision. Here it was the mistake of our politicians who held our troops in offensive positions on the Kursk direction almost to the point of disaster, practically to catastrophe. Then they had to flee because, you see, the politicians wanted to have negotiations with the Saudis from a better position at least. Nothing came of it for them, but we had to flee from the Kursk region. And as our troops were retreating, the Russians rushed into the Sumy region right on their heels. But I'll say it again, this is about the same level as what happened in the Kharkiv region. They're now in the area of Lipetsk and in the area of Vovchansk. So they rushed in, and that's it, they got stuck. In the same way, the Russians will just mill around near Yablonovka, Yunakovka, and so on, but nothing more. They won't advance any further. That is, on the one hand, there are serious fortifications there. That's the first thing. Secondly, reserves have now been redirected there, and our troops have already recovered from this strategic failure of our politicians. They've already recovered, and now in some areas, we're even regaining previously lost positions, pushing the Russians back. And we're advancing toward the Kursk direction, toward Tetkino, which is nearby to the west. The Russians came into our territory and we entered theirs. Alaverdi.
Friends, please like this video. Roman Grigorievich and I meet 3 times a week on my YouTube channel, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, to discuss the military and political situation. In the comments, write a few kind words in support of Ukraine and share your thoughts on Israel's special operation. Also, let us know where you're watching from. Share your location in the comments. Renowned military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Grigorievich, thank you. And as usual, see you again on Monday.